Hi, my name is John Crowley. I'm coming in from the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and I'm going to talk about open data. In particular, I'm going to talk about open data for resilience and how we're building out a system to work with our clients on how we can expand the amount of exposure and vulnerability data. I work in a part of the GPDRR, which is actually called the GPDRR Labs. We provide technical assistance to the rest of the bank on DRM initiatives and looking at how we were able to build out some of the technologies from remote sensing, as well as looking at open data. Our main mission is to figure out how we empower decision makers. This decision makers is not just at the international level. Actually, our focus is how we empower decision makers within our client governments. Often, this gets reduced to an equation. How do we begin to understand what the hazards are, what the risks or what the exposure and vulnerabilities are, so that we can calculate risk? This process of building out the map is actually quite complicated because while we have better exposure data from coming in from science and ever higher resolution hazard data, our exposure data, our vulnerability models still remain fairly coarse. As a result, our models can not quite capture at the level of resolution that we need in order to make good decisions and informed decisions for reducing risk. OpenDRI was created 2 years ago to begin to confront this challenge. We're working on how we enable our clients to make better decisions by giving them the ability to collect better data on their own. Now, we've run across several problems in this. The data may not exist at all. We go into a new engagement, we look and we find out if there's data. Oftentimes it does not exist. Exposure data may not be available. Often we also find that the data may exist, but it's locked away. Oftentimes ministries have their own internal battles around release of data. They may not wish to release it in formats that allow for reuse, and it may just be locked away sometimes in PDFs. And I think coming from our system, we're actually quite guilty of locking away many of our data in formats that can't be reprocessed and are not machine readable. Sometimes the data may exist, it may actually be accessible, but our clients may not have the ability to use it and turn it into decisions. Ultimately, our goal is to begin to push the decision making further and further down into the local communities, actually beginning with the communities themselves. How do we begin to build out that process? How do we begin to enable locals to make decisions that are informed by good data? So let me go into a little bit about what we're doing with open data for resilience and how it came about. Open data has long been known to be the foundation of the scientific method. Without that, our scientists would not be able to replicate results and pull together a process of evolution in the way that knowledge comes together. Over the time, it's also become the foundation for open government. How do we begin to create transparency and accountability by putting out the data by which we're making our decisions so that others can also follow along, replicate, and begin to become in alignment? The World Bank launched its Open Data Initiative 2 years ago, and it has become a transformational process, to say the least. What we've done is we put out our data in formats that are legally accessible, technically accessible, i.e. machine readable, and can be reused. The license has been set up so that we can put that data out and allow people to build new analyses on top of it. Some of the key principles here come straight from the idea of Web 3.0 or the semantic web. How do we publish all data at a known address so that it can be accessible? How can we publish them in open data standards so that our machines can read them, process them, and turn them into new knowledge? How do we allow for the discovery of new data based on those data sources so that a map can expand and show what other available data can be pulled from that area? And also, how do we set up the license and the legal regime so that that data can be reused? Open data for resilience really is aiming to reduce the impact of disasters. We want to empower decision makers with that information and tools so that they can make better risk decisions around how they manage risk. Now, one of the things that we do is we figure out how we work with partners to collect and curate the data. Here we're seeing Padang before and after of essentially a process that we've been working with OpenStreetMap and AAFDR and AusAid to begin to build out exposure data. In this case, you're seeing the change in the number of building footprints. Penang is actually very heavily mapped, along with other parts of Indonesia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and beginning to be Dakar. Now, one of the key elements of OpenDRI is that the collectors and curators are the communities themselves. This is a bottom-up driven process. The exposure data is actually collected by the communities through a training process. We give them the tools to be able to work with GIS, and actually sometimes what are called walking papers, which is a PDF that allows us to print out things like OpenStreetMap and be able to collect the data back into a GIS by having a QR code. But importantly, the co-mapping process, as we're calling it, involves decision makers in the communities. As we've seen with the work from AAFDR, the ability to take in the communities and the ward chiefs from Indonesia into the process of mapping out the area and having the mapper and the ward chief be able to work together on determining the authority of the data, the quality of the data, and then measuring out boundaries has proven to be pivotal in the ability to map and put together high resolution, ultra high resolution exposure data. Another thing that we try and do is to try and work in how we open up data using what we call the GeoNode, which is essentially a geo portal to allow us to catalog and put into open format many of the government data sets that already exist. This allows us in a way to not have to give up, not force a ministry to give up political control over the data. They own the GeoNode themselves. Same with other civil society partners. But they can open up and expose the data that they wish to an ecosystem, and then people can pull them in as layers through open data standards. Ultimately, the goal is to drive decision making at the local level. The process that you saw from having a relatively low resolution exposure data plus high resolution hazard data is something that we can begin to build out into something which we've seen from the InnoSafe project in Indonesia, which is another AusAid and AAFDR project with Geoscience Australia, is how do we begin to build out an open source tool that allows us to do impact modeling. It allows us to give a basic tool that allows the inclusion of hazard data through open web standards, the inclusion of OpenStreetMap data through open web standards, into an open source tool that works on what is called Quantum GIS, which is a free GIS editor that can be downloaded to any desktop on any operating system and pulled together into a basic exposure map. Here is the same area of Penang that you saw mapped with OpenStreetMap, turned from a blank spot to high level exposure data, and then combined with Geoscience Australia's hazard data to look at the potential seismic impact of within Penang. Ultimately, with this type of impact modeling, we can begin to show how investments might change the situation and the risk within an area. We're looking here in Indonesia at flood modeling, at seismic modeling, tsunami modeling. In Nepal, which is a case I'll talk about, we're looking at the safety of schools and of health clinics. Now, what we're trying to do is to drive resilience within the communities. Nepal is one of the more scary cases. City at extreme seismic risk. This is a place at high altitude. The airport will likely be unusable after an earthquake. The roads will likely be unusable to reach a city at altitude. And because it's at altitude, our helicopters or rotary wing aircraft will not be able to fly at the normal load that they would at a lower altitude, called the air density problem. Now, the plan here is to begin to analyze the seismic hazard with our science agency partners, and at the same time work with locals and local communities and CSOs to begin to build out the exposure data. Ultimately, the idea is to build out a detailed seismic risk assessment and then begin to make investments in particularly focused areas of understanding which schools, which health clinics are most at risk, and then how do we build that out. This is being done through a community of volunteers. Ultimately, they're going as small teams and collecting some very basic data about every building. This is the polygon of the building, the roof type, building type, the number of stories, and its current land usage. We're also seeing that this is reaching into women. We have specific groups that are training women in how to use GIS. This is all done through relatively simple tools. This is done on a weekly basis with training that happens every week in a small incubation space. And we were able to set this up. This is an editor where you can quickly edit polygons within a very basic amount of training. This is coming together very rapidly. Kathmandu, this is before we started. And you can see the density of streets greatly increasing. This is an area before we started. And you can see how much and how fast some of the exposure data is beginning to come in. Ultimately, this is going to be put into something very much akin to this image from Indonesia, an impact model where we can pull in, as you see on the left, it's a little blurry, I'm afraid, of pulling in a hazard, pulling in the exposure data, pulling in a scenario, and then looking at how this would impact an area. We're ultimately partnering with quite a number of NGOs, as well as the Ministry of Home Affairs within Nepal. We're also integrated in the Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium and trying to tie this together into a larger ecosystem of data sharing so that instead of having all of this data off in silos, we're able to begin to build a comprehensive model of how risk comes together. The local curation of the local data is one of our founding principles. The data belongs to those who have collected it. That process of building that out is largely done through the GeoNode that I mentioned before. GeoNode is also being implemented within Sri Lanka, and we're putting this in several other places within the East Asia Pacific and our South Asia regions, as well as within the Caribbean. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'll be available afterwards. Thank you very much.